Welcome to today's lecture. The topic is post-development, questioning the whole paradigm. This is an overview of what I'm going to talk about during the next 45 minutes, roughly. And I will be starting with post-development. What is this? It all began with the first prominent publication of post-development in the early 90s, which proclaimed that development is an unburied corpse spreading every kind of pest. Now, this rather polemical assertion was backed up by the claim that the idea of development stands like a ruin in the intellectual landscape. The last 40 years can be called the age of development, asserted Wolfgang Sachs. This epoch is coming to an end. The time is ripe to write its obituary. And this is what post-development set out to do. Now, to contextualize post-development in the field of development theory, we could say that if we condense different schools into one sentence, then the modernization theories were summed up in the sentence, the underdeveloped countries have to be developed. The dependency theories argued that development and underdevelopment are two sides of the same coin. Now, post-development argued development is an ideology and underdevelopment is an invention. Why that? To understand that, we have to take into account the context. As we all are, so are the post-development critics standing on the shoulders of giants. They are building on the work of Illich, Foucault, and anti-colonial critics like Gandhi or Fanon. Well, Fanon and Gandhi, despite their differences regarding the question of violence, were agreeing on the fact that the decolonizing societies, the newly independent countries, should not imitate Europe and Western societies. Michel Foucault has become known for investigating the link between discourse and power, between relations of power and the way we speak and write about certain topics. With this system of representation, there is always a relation of power involved. Ivan Illich is probably the least known. He formulated a critique of industrial modernity in which he argued that it teaches people to become dependent on experts and thereby lose their autonomy. So, post-development, building on these theorists, also argues that it is not inventing a new theory, but that it is theorizing the practice of social movements. It claims to have close links to local communities and social movements in the South, which are defending their cultural difference and their living space. And in contrast to other non-mainstream approaches, post-development is not interested in alternative development, but in alternatives to development, thus formulating a fundamental critique of the entire paradigm. Representatives of post-development, just to give a few examples, are Gustavo Esteva, Arturo Escobar, Vandana Shiva, Wolfgang Sachs, Gilbert Rist, Majid Rahneman, Claude Alvarez, Ashish Nandi, James Ferguson, and Serge Latouche. So, coming now to the core arguments, the first one of these is the invention of underdevelopment. Here, the post-development critics point to this invention taking place in a speech by US President Truman in 1949 as the point 4 of his inaugural address. And here Truman announced a program of development for the less developed regions. Now, post-development investigates this program, investigates development as a discourse, as an historically situated way of representing the world, which is linked with relations of power. Now, what is the historical context? What is this situation? The Cold War and decolonization made a new kind of relation to the Global South necessary. Here, the Russian Revolution had established a competitor to the capitalist system. And the imperative of US foreign policy was containment, was basically to push back and to obstruct the spread of communism. On the other hand, in various countries of Africa and Asia, strong anti-colonial movements were on the rise. And in this historical situation, the relation to the Global South in the form of colonialism did not seem as a viable future program. In his inaugural address, Truman was referring to the poverty of the so-called less developed countries, not only as a moral problem, but also as a threat and a handicap to the more prosperous areas. Why? A handicap because it hindered the expansion of US corporations into these markets, and a threat because, after all, the newly independent countries could become communist states. In this context, Truman made a significant point in distancing the United States from the old imperialism. Instead, he promised a program of development based on democratic fair dealing. And this new conception of North-South relations was far more appealing than the colonial discourse of white superiority, of course. However, it should not obstruct the fact that development was a program to legitimate a capitalist world order in the Global South through promising affluence, and maintaining a colonial division of labor was its prime function, because the North was very much interested in maintaining the access to these markets and to these resources, despite establishing now a new conception of North-South relations. So, this new program of development established a new perception of international relations and of identities. And the critics of post-development argue that through this new program, the majority of the world was defined as underdeveloped, so that their human diversity was reduced to catching up with the West. Coming to the second core argument, economics as culture. Post-development is opposing the economization of social relations, the imperative of economic growth, but also the discipline of economics in its entirety, because they argue it is a cultural discourse and not a science in the strict sense. First of all, post-development argues that in this perspective of economics, the good life is identified with material wealth. Therefore, the quality or the progress or the development of a society is being measured through the gross national product or the per capita income. And here post-development argues this is a very impoverished version of measuring progress or a good life. First of all, also because it fails to differentiate between different types of poverty. And here post-development talks about frugality on the one hand and destitution on the other hand. While frugality refers to a state where the basic needs, food, shelter, water, are being satisfied, but people are poor in the sense of having very little or no income, so they are unable to buy goods. This, however, they differentiate from a situation of destitution, where the basic needs for food, water, and shelter have been compromised because their access has been made dependent on financial income. So this is usually what took place with the onset of colonialism and capitalism. However, this means that a person with very little income but living in a frugal subsistence society might enjoy a higher standard of living in the sense of its basic needs being satisfied than a person with a higher income who might still suffer from destitution. The gross national product, however, does not differentiate between these two types of poverty. Coming to another point, the imperative of growth, criticized by post-development, is usually connected to the law of scarcity of economics. Here, Gustavo Esteva argues this law is constructed to denote the technical assumption that man's wants are great, not to say infinite. This assumption, however, post-development argues, is part of this cultural discourse that economics constitutes. They argue this is not necessary to assume that every human being functions this way, and they point to the fact that advertising has the role of producing ever new needs which can only be satisfied through the market. This, they argue, is a necessary element of a capitalist growth society. So, here we have a situation that through this perception that only what can be exchanged over the market counts as valuable, we perceive a disvaluing of other forms of knowledge, production, and exchange. For example, the productivity of nature is being completely ignored, as above all Vandana Shiva has pointed out. She argues that in economics it is assumed that production takes place only when mediated by technologies for commodity production, even when such technologies destroy life. A stable and clean river is not a productive resource in this view. It needs to be developed with dams in order to become so. Coming to the third argument, post-development argues that the concept of development functions as an amoeba. What is meant by this? They are referring to the fact that nowadays, from infrastructure projects like dams or roads to economic reforms, biodiversity conservation, or education for girls, all types of projects have been designated as leading to development. And here they argue this leads to a certain shapelessness. The term development becomes blurry. It can mean all sorts of things. And this is due to the numerous new and redefinitions of the concept of development that have been taking place during the history of development policy, referring to basic needs-oriented, participatory, or sustainable development. The term has repeatedly still promised affluence and produced misunderstandings because of the numerous different meanings. However, despite these numerous different meanings, there are still some constant features. The superiority of the West, so the assumption that the Western societies are developed, is still taken for granted, and so is usually the imperative of economic growth. And as a third feature, the legitimation of interventions in the lives of people defined as less development. These new and redefinitions are closely related to the cycle of development promise, which we have talked about in the lecture on the SDGs. Just to briefly reiterate, this cycle of development promise reaffirms the competence of the development experts and the development apparatus to formulate policies despite previous failures. And they do so by discovering new aspects of the object in need of intervention hitherto unnoticed. For example, rural poverty, women, the market, ecology, governance, microcredit, etc. Here, old failures are being explained and new strategies are being formulated through this discovery of a new aspect. Fourth argument, the anti-politics machine. Here, Ferguson and Escobar have pointed out that the discourse of development agencies favors technical solutions and ignores political conflicts at the root of problems. Why do they do that? Because They are oriented towards the means they have at their disposal. And they have only technical solutions in the form of a transfer of capital, a transfer of knowledge, a transfer of technology. But what they do not have at their disposal, what is not usually the business of development agencies, are fundamental changes in the relations of power on the local, national, or international level. However, these are the points that usually are decisive for questions of global inequality. And here, what the development apparatus is trying to do can be, in a somewhat simplified manner, summed up as trying to help the poor without hurting the rich. And this is an extremely difficult task. Ferguson therefore argues, by uncompromisingly reducing poverty to a technical problem, and by promising technical solutions to the sufferings of powerless and oppressed people, the hegemonic problematic of development is the principal means through which the question of poverty is depoliticized in the world today. So, the apparatus of development constructs problems, socio-economic problems of inequality, as solvable without changing relations of power, and casts itself as non-political, but performs political operations, namely organizing transfers of financial means or technologies to specific groups in a country. Ferguson recounts the story of one development expert finally asking him, the anthropologist, okay, what should we do then to help the people in Lesotho? And to this, Ferguson replied, well, if you want to help the people in Lesotho, you should take into consideration that most of them are migrant workers in the mines in South Africa. So what you should do is to do something about the oppression of the unions in South Africa. For example, contemplate sanctions against the apartheid regime. And to this, the development expert replied, no, I mean development. We can't afford to get involved in politics. Apparently, these are perceived as two different areas. So, number 5 of the core arguments, the end of the development era. Here, post-development argues there are 4 reasons why this era is coming to an end. The first one is the ecological predicament. It has become abundantly clear that the industrial model of society cannot be universalized for reasons of resource scarcity and for reasons of pollution, and nowadays, above all, for reasons of climate change. Second reason, the end of the Cold War is what the post-development critics in the 90s identified as something which would also accelerate the end of this era. If the origin of the concept of development was the Cold War and the idea to basically bribe or convince the newly decolonizing countries to remain within the capitalist world order, then the end of the Cold War would mean that this promise becomes superfluous. However, here we have to say that despite the Cold War being over, the concept of development is still with us. A third reason they gave for the end of the development era is that they argue the promise of development has turned out to be a failure. A failure not in the sense of no progress at all being made in these countries, but a failure in the sense of, for large parts of the population, there has been no significant improvement in the standards of living, and above all, the gap between developed and less developed countries is not smaller than it was in the 1950s and 60s, but has become wider. The exception to this rule are only a few countries in Southeast Asia and above all China. The fourth point is that post-development argues more and more people would realize that development was in fact a homogenizing concept, leading to what they describe as the westernization of the world. And for all these reasons, they are arguing the epoch of development is coming to an end and we should prepare for a post-development era. Now, coming to the last of the core arguments, what is meant by alternatives to development? Here, post-development is arguing that what is needed is not an alternative way to become like the West, to become a modern society, but a fundamental alternative. And they argue these fundamental alternatives are already in the making and can be witnessed in the self-organized ways of living as a result of exclusion by the project of development. This project consisting in the universalization of the Western models of politics, the economy and knowledge have led to many people finding no place in these new structures after the old structures have been destroyed. And here they argue the people themselves are inventing new ways, new models, and models in which they are reclaiming the commons, often relating to cultural traditions. Models in which they are reclaiming politics from the state, reclaiming the economy from the market, and reclaiming knowledge from science. So here they point to these local communities and social movements in which these alternatives to development could be witnessed. Sometimes they point to the Chipko movement in India, where above all women have been protecting trees from logging by protecting them with their bodies and hugging them. They are pointing to the black communities, the Protesto de Comunidades Negras in Colombia, for example, or to the Zapatistas in Mexico. Since 2008 and 2009, many people have also been pointing to the concept of buen vivir being enshrined in the constitutions of Bolivia and Ecuador, which is undoubtedly also a post-development concept. Some are also pointing to Harb Zadeghi in Iran, which became a doctrine after the Islamic Revolution of the new state. And this is important because it alerts us to the fact that alternatives to the West and alternatives to development do not necessarily always have to be progressive alternatives. Recently, the democratic autonomy in the areas liberated by the Kurdish movement in Syria and Rojava have also been described as an alternative in the sense of post-development. Looking a bit more closely at one of these alternatives to development, we can cast a glance at the Zapatista communities in Chiapas, Mexico, which are in rebellion to the Mexican state since 1994. And here we find that, talking about political alternatives, there is no cooperation with the state, despite an ongoing low-intensity conflict. And the alternatives in the realm of politics consist of political offices rotating between different persons and being voluntary in order to prevent a professional class of politicians to emerge. Also, there is an imperative mandate of all representatives, summed up in the sentence, "Aquí manda el pueblo y el gobierno obedece." Here, the people rule and the government obeys. The political alternatives can also be found in the general idea of the Zapatistas that there cannot be one model which would fit everyone, but that they have to strive for a world in which many worlds fit. So to say, a pluriverse in opposition to a universe. Talking about the economic alternatives, they comprise land occupations and collective land rights, and it is notable that the Zapatistas are not only engaging in subsistence agriculture as envisioned by some of the texts, but are also producing in a fair trade manner for the world market. There is also an important role for women's cooperatives and for the idea of madre tierra, that is, for the idea that the land which they till is not only a resource to produce goods to be sold, but is Mother Earth to which they build a special relation by working the land. Talking about the area of knowledge, the Zapatistas have established autonomous schools in which classes are being taught in indigenous languages and in which they strive for an education which corresponds to practical needs, not to the needs that you might have when you live in Mexico City. In the area of health, they have been establishing autonomous health centers in which promotores, so health workers and physicians and midwives, are working together and are guided by a holistic understanding of the human body and soul. They are combining indigenous and modern medicine, so on the one hand falling back on the traditional knowledge of the wise women who use traditional herbs, but on the other hand they are also at times falling back to the provisions of modern medicine. So, the post-development school has been widely discussed in development theory and often harshly criticized. I will, in the following section, present the most important of these criticisms. Number one, post-development has been criticized as constituting the last refuge of the noble savage. So, the last refuge of an idea of an uncorrupted, pure, pre-modern or pre-colonial way of living. And this has been criticized because usually these projections have never been able to point to a reality which corresponds to this pure and uncorrupted lifestyles and cultural traditions. They have always been patriarchy or other relations of oppression to be found also in these pre-modern or pre-colonial societies. A second point of criticism is the total rejection of Western modernity that is being attributed to post-development. And here they argue this rejection would show a contempt for the benefits of Western modernity, like a higher life expectancy through progress in medicine or labor-saving technology. Now, related to this, they point out that if progress or certain ideas are rejected because they come from the West, post-development would actually engage in cultural relativism, pointing out cultural differences and postulating an incompatibility of cultures. Here, the critics argue post-development would legitimize oppression in the sense that women's or human rights would be seen as Western and therefore as inapplicable to the local population. A third point of criticism consists of the reproach of Pontius Pilate politics, so washing one's hands of the politics of the movements that one supports. This means post-development is accused of having no normative orientation in terms of which grassroots movements should be supported. And if one continues this line of thinking, if post-development is concerned with local roots, with the rejection of Western modernity, with the defense of cultural traditions, one might also argue that the Islamic State could also be seen as a kind of post-development movement. However, on the other hand, it can be pointed out that this lack of a normative orientation can also be interpreted as a commitment to ideas of radical democracy, not to prescribe how a good society looks like, but trusting the people to invent their own. A fourth point of criticism can be demonstrated very vividly through the text of Majid Rahnema, in which he describes development as a socio-cultural variant of AIDS, as a kind of virus which would spread across the world through volunteers or tourists or multinational corporations, and which transforms subsistence societies, vernacular societies as he calls them, by undermining their immune system. Now, this is a very powerful analogy which often describes the transformation of subsistence societies quite well, but on the other hand, it reveals that here Rahnema, or in general the post-development experts showing a similar argument, describe Western societies as somehow sick. So basically they are here occupying the role of the doctor who diagnoses what's wrong with the society. And this, if you think about it, implies that there is in fact another universal scale, not the universal scale of the gross national product, not the universal scale of development, but a different one along which one can position societies as healthy or as sick. So here we have implicitly the return of what has been described as a position of a development expert, the one who judges from the outside what's wrong with this society. So, if we look at all these criticisms, the rejection of Western modernity and the other points that have been mentioned, and if we now analyze the post-development writings, we find that indeed all of the accusations have some reason, have some evidence to point to in relation to post-development texts, but only to some post-development texts. We find, in fact, that within post-development there are two competing discourses, one of which can be described as Neo-Populist post-development, which in fact totally rejects Western modernity, preaches the return to vernacular societies and subsistence agriculture, holds cultural traditions in high esteem, but perceives cultures as static. Nevertheless, Neo-Populist post-development demands self-determination and rejects domination in the name of development. On the other hand, there is a related but somehow quite different discourse which can be described as skeptical post-development. And skeptical post-development readily admits that some elements of Western modernity are very useful and is more in favor of a hybridization of tradition and modernity. In contrast to the neo-populist variant, skeptical post-development would also reject universal blueprints and argues that different lifestyles are possible, also Western ones. Thirdly, there's a skeptical stance towards cultural traditions, arguing that non-Western traditions are not necessarily better than Western ones. Here, the skeptics also take a different position than the neo-populists. And a very important point, within skeptical post-development, cultures can be seen as dynamic. So a constructivist perspective on culture would readily accept that new elements, feminism, homosexuality, or what have you, could be appropriated by certain cultures. And this is the decisive point which would rob certain, usually old men, to define what belongs to a culture and what has no place in this culture and therefore can be banned, put into prison or executed. So in the end, skeptical post-development also demands self-determination and rejects domination in the name of development, but also rejects domination in the name of culture. I'm coming now to the last part of the lecture. So if post-development points out these colonial continuities, how do we decolonize development policy? Is this possible? And if so, how? The first point is that we have to be aware that there are ideas of living well beyond the Western model of development, beyond the Western models of politics, the economy, and knowledge, exemplified here in the political alternatives of the Zapatista movement in Chiapas. However, if I have just said the Western models, I'm being inaccurate. Because if we look closely, we find also within the West, within the Western traditions, opponents to these models. From Marx to Robert Kennedy, who's being depicted here. Kennedy, in 1968, delivered a speech in which he criticized the gross national product as a seriously flawed way of measuring a good society. And he indicated that there might be some alternative ideas which do not form part of this measurement. And in this speech, he talked about the intelligence of our public debate, the integrity of our public officials, the beauty of our poetry, the joy of our children's play, or the strength of our marriages. And this is very much in line with the post-development criticism that life actually is much, much more than the economic indicators suggest that it is. And these opponents basically alert us to the fact that these Western models are merely those who became hegemonic in the West, but were by no means uncontested. These opponents also remind us that there are alternative conceptions of wealth urgently needed. One example of them is the Happy Planet Index, which comprises life expectancy, subjective well-being, inequality, and especially the ecological footprint of societies. And if we now look at the map that the Happy Planet Index gives us, we realize that the green areas, which indicate a high index, are not to be found in the industrialized capitalist societies of Western Europe and North America, but rather in some countries in Middle America or Southeast Asia, especially, where a moderate standard of living and a moderate life expectancy are being combined with a lower ecological footprint than we find in the resource-intensive and pollution-intensive industrialized societies. Another point related to decolonizing development policy is the rejection of the geographical distribution of problem-solving knowledge. This means that in orthodox development policy, problems are located in developing countries and the knowledge to solve these problems in so-called developed countries. However, this neglects the expertise of migrants in the north, or of people in the south, especially indigenous people. And it prevents a learning from the south, from the perspective of the north. And there is a lot to learn if we look from philosophical concepts like Ubuntu up to very practical judicial applications like the Gacaca courts in Rwanda after the genocide. There are many instances where the North, in fact, could learn a lot from countries of the South. This is, however, being prevented by the idea that we are already developed here. In general, although in development cooperation it has become fashionable to talk about an eye level between donors and recipients, we can constitute that this is impossible as long as there are the hierarchies between the donors and the recipients, the ones who give the money and the ones who are dependent on this money, but also because of hierarchies in the norms. Whose models count as universal models, whose knowledge counts as science, and whose does not. Also, there are the hierarchies, even beyond any Eurocentrism, between experts, between the educated planners who know how to do development and between those affected by the problems that these projects often give rise to. And here it is important to dismantle the hierarchy between the experts, the trustees, and the affected persons. Here, there has been some progress already in development policy in terms of accountability and empowerment. And one notable example is the inspection panel of the World Bank, which constitutes a mechanism of accountability where project-affected persons can file claims if projects funded by the World Bank do not adhere to their social and environmental standards. A general point, however, has of course also been made and will be expanded on in the lecture on neocolonialism. And this general point is referring to the global economic structures, which of course are at the moment organizing a financial transfer from the south to the north, which amounts to 1,000 billion US dollars per year. Here, transformations in the areas of debt, repatriation of profits, tax evasion, and world trade in general are needed to stop this neo-colonial exploitation. So, one last point, and a rather general point, is that we are not only facing a problem of global inequality, but we are also faced with the fact that the struggle against global inequality is usually framed as a struggle against underdevelopment. And as the post-development critique makes clear, if it is framed like that, then it still reproduces some colonial notions about some countries being superior and others inferior. So the struggle against global inequality could be framed differently as a struggle against exploitation and oppression and not against underdevelopment, as a struggle for self-reliance and global justice instead of a struggle for more development aid. To conclude, post-development has alerted us to the fact that the Western model of society is only one among many and not necessarily a superior one. It rejects being defined as underdeveloped and manifests the will not to be classified, degraded, and governed in the name of development. And it shows that a different frame for perceiving global inequality is necessary, maybe in terms of exploitation. And talking about new ideals, post-development gives us some inspirations in terms of a pluriverse, in terms of struggling for self-determination, for justice, for solidarity, in terms of rejecting the imperative of the growth society, and in general, in terms of seeing hospitality as an ideal that societies should strive to. Thanks for the attention.